Hello and welcome along to A State of Mind Sell the Jerseys, the podcast that takes a look at football kits, football culture and everything else in between. Well, in this episode we're looking at some of the bits in between as we take a look at the world of computer games and their links to football. And joining me this episode is Joe Donnelly. Joe is a journalist, a writer, a video games enthusiast and mental health advocate. He's written about both subjects for The Guardian and New Statesman, Vice, PC Gamer, IGN and Edge, to name but a few. He is indeed a man of many clubs. And Joe is no stranger to the world of football. He is a multimedia reporter at Celtic, having featured often in commentary duties on Celtic TV, various media outlets, and in 2019 had 2 books published: Homegrown Hero, the biography of Celtic player James Forrest, and Checkpoint, how video games power up minds, kick ass and save lives. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, and that is a fantastic introduction. I'll need to get that recorded and I can play it to my girlfriend.
JP, who's my last guest on the podcast, complained that his intro wasn't as grand as it should be.
Is that
so
right?
So I really had to up my game, and so I hope that I'm glad you're happy with that one.
No, fantastic. I'm pulled over.
The beautiful game is hard to replicate in any other format other than with a ball and a grass pitch. Football is passion, agony, ecstasy, and its moments of sheer brilliance played over 90 minutes. It is a sport that pulls us in as spectators and leaves us thinking about moments of what ifs for days, even years to come afterwards. When these dramas are not being played out live, generations of us have tried to revisit moments, capture lightning in a jar and play out fantasy matches on Subbuteo tabletops. Millions of us get our fix through the ever-changing medium of video games. This is A State of Mind Sell the Jerseys, 8-bit kits and sensible soccer stars.
Just a bit of history.
It is. Out with a shot and it's there.
And he's got to go to Middlesbrough and get something. And I'll tell you, honestly, I will love it if we do that. Love it.
You can't win anything with kids.
Just as football evokes memories for us, so too do football games. And all it takes can be sometimes the sound of a loading Spectrum screen to make us reminisce of the days gone by. On this front, Joe, what's the first sort of football game or game that brings to mind for you?
I was Atari ST, but in terms of introduction to computer games, but I was quite young. It was more games like Lemmings and Dominoes and stuff like that. Which I kind of attached to that. So whilst there were loads of management and kind of really good football simulators for the time there, it was more probably into the PlayStation era, which I got more interested in FIFA and international soccer. Pro was the first one I had in PlayStation. But if I'm thinking about the Atari ST, it'd be Sensible Soccer. That was a top-down classic. Which is strange. I mean, it's still a classic today. There's a lot of games which haven't really aged well over the years. Naturally, it's the nature of the medium. But I can pick up Sensible Soccer today and still have so much fun with it. International Superstar Soccer Deluxe on the SNES, the kind of 2D side-on football game, was probably my first experience of a football game where it felt like the real thing. That's a game that probably hasn't aged that well. We were speaking before we started recording about if you took a shot in that game and it went wide of the mark, you could knock over the cameraman. And I remember at the time, being used to Sensible Soccer where it's very, you move and the kind of diagonal tangents and you kick the ball this way and it's really easy to get by people or dive in with a big tackle and stuff like that. This you've missed a shot, and it's an aside. After that, you're ready just to get back on with the game, and he's a cameraman lying sprawled out on his back, and it just felt like, wow, I was playing something like watching the telly. But yeah, I mean, the Sensible Soccer is definitely one which, as I say, I can go back and play now and still have so much fun with.
Sensible Soccer certainly can conjure up so many memories of the sounds and the songs of the game as well, and also the amount of different players and teams you could have from all across the world, with like Sensible World of Soccer, which opened up leagues from all sorts of different places. And I remember, like myself, seeing people in school swapping that on their Amiga discs, which later on we're going to have a look at that, how big a deal that actually was as well with the rise of computer games. But the nature of being a football fan has been something that we tried to replicate in so many different ways. And even going back to Victorian times, where they had a game called Snip Kick, which was like a tabletop game, and then in the 1940s, New Footy comes about. Later on, Subbuteo arrives into the scene, and these were kind of advertised through boys' magazines and through comics and things like Boys Own, and sold, like, you'd send in money, and then they would send you back a game which would be consisting of plastic goals and plastic players, but you would be having to mark out your own pitch on an army blanket. They send you a piece of chalk, just like that kind of idea of later on in the, sort of as time went on. Joe, did you have any sort of times of Subbuteo in your youth at all? Were you a tabletop gamer at all as a boy?
Sort of. I'm an only child, so I've always gone about how lonely I was, and how computer games were a lot easier for me to play Subbuteo on your own. It can be fun, but it's better if you're playing against people. Pro Action Soccer, the magnetised one. I remember my mate having that and thinking that was such a big step up from Subbuteo. I did have Subbuteo, and I enjoyed it. I probably enjoyed it again because I was playing on my own. And in terms of the kind of overlap between real world football and Subbuteo, I remember the goal that David Beckham scored when he kind of announced himself at Man United against Wimbledon when he scored for the halfway line. I remember trying to replicate that on a studio pitch. Big goals from Paul McStay, John Collins, and the kind of big 90s stars for Celtic at the time, Josh Cadet in his debut against Aberdeen. I remember taking Subbuteo and trying to do, because I remember you spoke about the magazines, they would show you like different skills and tricks, and if you flick the player this way, he'll catch the ball and it'll curve it. You could recreate Del Piero's curling free kicks or Roberto Carlos against France or whatever. It was never, I mean, there are guys who can do it to with real skill. I was terrible at it. I was more knocking over the cameraman at the side of the goals. But
my brother, he had players, some of my teams, but like my uncle Frankie had a Subbuteo set at my grand's, and me and my cousin Gerard used to play on a Sunday at my grand's spare room, but like we didn't have a ball because it was an old set, so we used to use my granny's soaps, these tiny soaps. So eventually get to the point when you just abandon the game and just squeezing each other's faces. But my brother got really into Subbuteo. He got teams, and I'm going to be putting up some pictures of some of the teams shortly, and he loved it. He would have a World Cup every year. With teams doubling up as other ones, so and also I did a Scottish Premier League, and faithfully every Saturday on his own in the living room carpet, just flicking his teams. But obviously Celtic in the 90s were terrible. Well, not terrible. Celtic struggled in the 90s and Rangers were the dominant force, but somehow Celtic seemed to win the Subbuteo League quite a lot as well. He also had a fake team called Helensburgh, who did quite well in Subbuteo as well in his team. And players that were kind of, he knew who were the main players, and that was his week was spent. So even though he'd Juventus, he would use them as like Ayr United. And in Scotland, in their Tartan outfit, they were Morton. So he really enjoyed it. But a lot of Subbuteo injuries, like kind of kneeling on players, my mum hoovering people up, my dad going like that, right, is this still like, you still playing Subbuteo? You still playing this game on like the Wednesday because it was still set up because he had a midweek fixture just right in the middle of the living room?
I think, I mean, for all like the kind of tabletop stuff wasn't necessarily my forte. I think like in terms of laying the foundations for people who are maybe interested in Football Manager or Championship Manager, as known back then, which we'll no doubt discuss over the course of this conversation. But I think that level of enthusiasm, speaking about your brother, either replicating, mirroring real world football or creating your own worlds, I think that speaks for the escapism which tabletop and video games can afford you. As you say, I mean, there's nothing worse than a derby defeat or something, but if you can then replay it in FIFA, or if you can replay it on Subbuteo and your team comes out as the winner, then I think that's fantastic.
Do you see a link then between tabletop games and and those who would have been moving into doing like writing early computer games?
I think so. I think that computer games, like any other, and tabletop as well, but like any other media entertainment, they're made by passionate people who are really kind of impressing their personalities onto things. So I think that if you're really interested in football and you're playing tabletops at the time, and even something incidental like, a goal that you scored in Subbuteo, for example, and then how that made you feel and things, and without sounding overly profound, but you could take that, and if you're writing anything into Football Manager, or if you're anything to do with FIFA, I think that you take the things you enjoy and then you can recreate that in artistic form. So I think absolutely, I think they're tied. I think certainly my own memories with computer games, and maybe I would, if there was a World Cup on or the Euros, I would find myself recreating some of those tournaments or playing it more, and I think that's only natural.
I think like even with that point, how the people wanted to have accessories and sets and different things that were out and available, and it was this idea of enhancing as much as you could, giving you that real experience, or that experience of being in a World Cup, or having all the things that make it real. And there was still this idea of it being aimed at kids though, and I think whenever computer games started off, a lot of adults would have dismissed gaming as something that's purely done for children or for young people. What would your thoughts be on that?
I think sadly that stigma still exists today. Interestingly, in terms of what we've experienced globally in the last year or so, with the global pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns that we've seen, a lot of parents do still believe that video games are child's play. They're enjoyed by kids, but the average age of gamers now is 35, I think, and so that shows that obviously adults are well invested in video games. But in terms of the last year or so, I have got a sense that stigma is shifting slightly. Attitudinally, parents have spent a lot of time indoors. They've spent a lot of time with their children indoors. So a lot of parents, to their credit, who I've spoken to, have been taking that time to sit down with their kids and just learn. Not necessarily, football games. Even Fortnite, for example, has been a brilliant way for kids to interact during lockdown. So they've not been able to go out exploring in the real world, but they've been able to go into Fortnite where the rules have stayed the same. So for all our rules have changed, everything's shut or you need to stay indoors, those rules are understood and they can mix with their friends and they can speak online. And a lot of parents have been taking that time to understand Fortnite or Football Manager or any of those kind of games and realising that it's not as scary as they thought. So the stigma still exists, and we've come on a long way since the 90s from early video games. But unfortunately, that kind of element of child's play is still attached to video games. It's a multi-billion pound industry, video games, which is a real shame. And even if you look at Scotland alone, you think of Rockstar North, Grand Theft Auto, one of the most popular games in the history of video game series, in the history of video games. That was started off as DMA Design up in Dundee. They've moved to Edinburgh, still headquartered in Scotland, and they're really flying the flag for video games. You mentioned Fortnite. Epic Games have now got an office in Edinburgh as well, which employs so many people there, and they're creating updates for Fortnite. So there's two of the biggest video games which have got offices in Scotland, which are creating millions of pounds for the creative industries in this country, and yet we still, a lot of circles, kind of look at it as child's play, which frustrates as a video games advocate. But that is improving.
Aye. If we're going to look at games and the subject of this episode this week, I think we're going to come back out and have a kind of say goodbye to Subbuteo, which is not a nostalgic look. I think the whole podcast in that really as well. But even today, Subbuteo are now launching their Lionesses, the women's team as well, the women's set, and also the idea as well that a lot of the players who continue to play Subbuteo nowadays, it's people who have taken it from their childhood and moved forward with it, but they're really making an active aim in not having to compete with things like FIFA or things like Pro Evolution Soccer, but to exist separately. And there is a place within football, and there's a place within leisure for things like that. But we're going to look at gaming today, Joe, and the idea of the introduction of computers into the UK. Arcades had been for a long time a source of entertainment across the world, from even you think back to kind of the coin machines of the 19th century and penny arcades, and then as technology begins to improve and build up, you have all of a sudden in the 1970s there's this bang, 1978 Space Invaders arrives, and people are flocking to put money in these machines. How much, Joe, Do you see this as being an impact on the kind of popular culture of that time?
Yeah, I mean it's massive, isn't it? Like it's to think about video games broadly compared to more traditional media. So say, I don't know, books, for example. Video games kind of started to become popular in the 70s, really kind of came into their own in the 80s, and then from the 90s it's just really taken off. I think that it's still quite a young medium, which is probably why it still struggles with some of the stigmas which it does. But yeah, I mean, I think even if you don't consider yourself a gamer, I mean, if you think back to when Pong first came on the scene, if we use the kind of, I know that it is very kind of primitive. It's basically just moving a paddle up and down and a ball going back and forth. A ball consisting of, pixelated square and really primitive now. But I mean, the essence of that is it's football. You're going back and forth. Okay, maybe closer to tennis, but you're going back and forth, playing competitively. And you think about how far that's come to esports, where people are playing FIFA for a living. A lot of the big clubs have got, either in FIFA or in PES, people who they employ to make money in playing tournaments wearing, be it a Celtic jersey, Man United, whoever it is. I think it's fascinating. I think that the fact that video games have come so far in that time, I know that it's rooted in technology, obviously, but to have come so far in the last 40, 50 years as a medium, I think is incredible. Even comparing, the last 30 years or so, some of the games which we mentioned there, the early sensible soccer games, FIFA, and where we're at now with those games, Football Manager, how complex that is now. I think it's incredible how far the medium has come.
At this point in the 1970s, if you think what Britain is, or where they are economically and then politically, where we're just coming out of discontent, there's been strikes, there's economic stagnation in the 70s, but then by 1983, Britain has the highest use or the highest rate of computer ownership in the world. So who are buying these computers at this time?
I mean, it's back in the early 80s, as you say, you mentioned the kind of discontent there. I think it's embracing a new technology, isn't it? A kind of younger generation at the time playing computer games, and that's probably where the stigma comes from, that the video games at the time were mostly considered child's play, which is probably fair enough in the early 80s, but then that reflects directly on the average age of a video game player now, 35, that's how old I am. So if I was playing video games in, for me, it was my introduction was the late 80s, early 90s. But if that's the average video game player, if you were, in your formative years in the late 70s, early 80s, you're now at your 40s, and still enjoying video games now, I think we'll just see that going up and up and up. And that's where the stigma has failed to keep up. If video games have been played by younger people right at the very start, naturally they've got older and they've continued to play. There are millions of people all over the world who are discovering video games now. The thought of Fortnite being the first game that you play, the thought of Football Manager 2021 being the first game you play, your first console cycle is PlayStation 5 or a PC with a GTX 3080 graphics card as opposed to BBC computers in primary school or whatever. That blows my mind, but it's keeping up with that. And it's also, as people consider older, maybe like ourselves and older than us again, keeping up and keeping the traditions going as well. I think Fortnite's brilliant. I think that the new Football Manager, what you can do in that game now is incredible. FIFA looks like, it's like Sky Sports or Premier Sport, whatever you choose to watch your football on. It's simulating the television experience, not necessarily football, because we would be playing through the eyes of a player. You're simulating what you see on the TV. But I think it's important to keep the legacy going, because it's hard to play sensible soccer now. It's hard to, unlike being able to pick up, Citizen Kane, for example, in film, it's harder to get FIFA International Soccer 1994, without going to the kind of murky areas of emulation. So I think it is important to, fly the flag for the retro side of things as well.
I think too, what we're looking at in the modern day is that people like ourselves, you're used to playing the new games, but it's also because we've played the old games, we have that nostalgia, that thing that just gets you when you hear that wee ching or the loading screen of the Spectrum that kicks in. Whereas you've got young kids who maybe nowadays might not appreciate having to look at these graphics and what's this meant to be? Who's that? Why has every team got to wear the same colour of strip? That maybe that we don't get. But what happened as well if you think about our age, the people who were teenagers back then, all of a sudden, this new rise in computer ownership is now creating a new generation or the first generation of people that are writing their own code.
Yeah.
And you nodded to DMA Design. These guys would have started off probably working at home, working in their bedrooms, and writing things, or you have whole computer companies that are built up from two people sitting creating a game.
Yeah.
This is now all of a sudden a brand new industry that's kicked off in the UK. And whilst computer games have been around since the 70s or the late 70s, there wasn't really what we're looking at today with this idea of looking at football within, and particularly those who'd come from America within the arcades. They were really not into football. They did an NASL league that was dying at this point. Also Atari is a big company, but Atari had ownership as well in NASL and the Cosmos too. Yeah. And when they kind of went bankrupt, or when they went not bankrupt, but when they lost a lot of money on the ET game, one of the first things that they did was stop financing the Cosmos. So, Joe, almost the fall of Atari nearly kills the video game industry as well overnight, doesn't it?
Yeah. Can I ask if you've ever played ET?
No, I've never. I've seen it. I've watched it on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I've seen the movements and I've watched it in the documentaries too.
Yeah.
Have you played it?
It's one of those ones, right? As somebody who, I thought it sounded too flowery, but who enjoys being creative, I don't want to be too disparaging of someone else's work. ET is hands down the most frustrating game on the planet. When I was doing a bit of freelance for Vice a number of years ago, I strapped a heart monitor to myself and played ET to see how my heart rate jumped, and sure enough it was going through the roof, because this is easily the most frustrating game you've ever played. About trying to get ET home, naturally it's kind of hamstrung by the kind of the graphics and the technical capabilities of the computers at the time. It is torture. If ever a game was going to nearly bankrupt an industry, it's definitely that. I didn't get a chance to watch the documentaries about all the copies that are buried in, is it New Mexico?
Is that right?
Yeah, they basically had all these surplus copies that they couldn't sell and didn't know what to do with them, so they went into landfill. And then there's a documentary out that basically re-excavates them and gets sees that they're still there in the original case and all that kind of stuff. But to think that given how popular the movie was.
Yeah.
And I think it was one of those ones as well, like crunch in the industry is something which the video game industry really struggles with now. Crunch, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically being forced to work very long hours under real duress to get something finished. Cyberpunk 2077 from CD Projekt Red is probably, anyone who knows video games, that released last year, and it's launched with some really significant problems in terms of bugs because they crunched to get it finished. Apparently ET was the same. Back then, they had the license and they had this popular movie which they're trying to build a game about, and didn't have time to finish it. And with all due respect to the people that created it, it's very clear that they
royally
didn't
goosed
have
up
the time. Yeah, but I mean, as you say, that the impact that could have had on, I know we're here to talk about football and computer games, but the impact which that could have and very nearly did have an industry is immense. To think how what we could have missed out on if things had went differently.
$25 million was the licensing fee that they put in place, and I think
Incredible.
it was a way to try and get Steven Spielberg, I think, to switch studios.
Yeah.
And just like, we'll make the game in a total 2 months or something development time.
That's right. Yeah.
Man, this is really bad. But it's funny how that almost kills off the industry. And we think of Atari now, it's very back in the day.
Yeah.
But Leon, who's one of the first strips we're going to look at just now, wear the Leon Atari shirt.
Yeah.
Joe, football games on consoles, and those were created by arcade companies, football was kind of put to the side in favour of spacemen and plumbers. But in the UK, where we are now going to have our own creative boom of games, so many of the football games come in the UK, and in the 1980s sees the real launch of them happening over here. Match Day 1984, there's exciting soccer for the Amstrad, international soccer on the Commodore. And speaking of Commodore, Joe, there's what strip comes to mind if you think of Commodore Amiga sponsorships?
Commodore's slightly before my time, and I know that that's not normally a good phrase to use, but I always go back to legacy with video games. I don't know what's coming to your mind. I'm drawing a blank.
Well, 1990s Chelsea.
Yeah,
1980s Chelsea.
Of course, yeah.
Cascarino, Paul Elliott.
Yeah.
wearing it, and like Amiga was like when I was about 12 or so, a lot of my friends had Commodore Amigas, but you know they were the team that sponsored Chelsea. Chelsea during a time where they weren't very successful.
Yep.
Second division Chelsea,
Yep.
first division Chelsea, and then Premiership side Chelsea, but pre-Roman Abramovich times.
Yeah.
And I've totally forgot that actually when Celtic played PSG in 1995, I think Amiga was the sponsor on the PSG strip at the
It's
time.
incredible. It's incredible because that doesn't even feel that long ago. And the thought of Amiga now is it's a different era.
Amiga Power also lent itself to Bayern Munich in the
Yep.
1980s.
Yep.
Lothar Matthäus inspired Bayern Munich. Did classic red Adidas strip with white stripes and the Commodore across the front. But Chelsea for me is the one that always comes up.
Yeah.
For some reason, like Cascarino, Gordon Jury, quite a lot of Scottish people as well in the side too, and Irish people, Cascarino, also Celtic Rangers links too playing down there. Joe, around this time, there is a programmer called Kevin Toms who writes a program called Football Manager. Toms initially wanted to write a board game in his head, but he found it easier to write it as a program rather than a board game. And this, Joe, is the first of its kind. It's the earliest inception of a football management sim. It's going to eventually spawn Premier Manager and Championship Manager and all the other manager games that come. But the idea of not just a spaceman or a jumping or shooting asteroids or Pac-Man running around a maze, but the idea of this RPG that you are, it was massively popular in 1980s RPGs, but the idea that you are a football manager making these decisions, this is a total escapism from reality. You're leading your club through. Joe, what is the thing that really pulls people in about football management games?
It's interesting that you made the comparison between RPG role-playing games and football management games, because as somebody who loves video games, who's worked in video games media and also loves football, and there isn't an abundance of people who work in football media, who work in video games media who are that interested in football. So speaking to people about Football Manager who were, maybe working on the kind of nitty-gritty strategy RPG games, Civilization, or any of Paradox Interactive games, or the kind of more medieval or sci-fi leaning RPGs, to make the comparison with Football Manager, my argument is always you need to have a cursory enjoyment of football. If you absolutely hate football, you're probably not going to like Football Manager. But if you like manipulating statistics, or if you like following set rules in order to achieve something. So as long as you just don't mind football, I would always say to people, give Football Manager a chance. You're swapping Dungeons and Dragons for dugouts, and there'll be something for alliteration there that's not coming to me just now. But I think the thought of winning a World Cup as a player in a video game, even as crude as the graphics might have been in the late 80s and early 90s, from there on makes sense. But to be leading a group of players as manager kind of gives you that kind of, not godlike, but a kind of superiority, in the same way that if you're playing, I mentioned Civilization there, where you're building towns and you're making townships and making sure everybody is living well in these harmonious colonies and communities. If you're playing SimCity and you're building a city from the foundations of the earth. As Football Manager, you're doing that because in these football management games, you're not just the manager, you're also doing a wee bit of director of football, you're also the chief exec that's maybe signing sponsorships or things like that. So you're getting to, just see this empire rise from the ground. And I think that the comparisons with RPGs, maybe it's medieval, maybe it's sci-fi, maybe it's high fantasy, I think that's lost sometimes. And I think that if you boil it down, that's what football management games are, naturally rooted in football, but I think it captures all that kind of level of fantasy in a game itself.
You talked about in your book, which we'll look at later on as well, about how when games have been introduced, there's always been this idea of storytelling, but now obviously with the advances in the modern game, there is this is much more sophisticated storytelling. And really, it's regardless of what level it is with Football Manager, whether it was Kevin Toms' original incarnation or the modern day, your challenge is basically the same. Your dugouts in Division 2, they're going that way. And like I found myself with Football Manager, Champ Manager was the one I love the best from the times. But like, you know, having conversations with myself about and another player in my head, or you know, you'll see somebody and you'll go, we should sign him. He was quite good in Champ, but knowing that then later on in real life, going, I don't know what happened to him. I don't know why he was crap in real life. I don't know what. There's so many different things that, you know, we kind of go through when we play these games. Joe, do you have any alter egos, or do you play yourself, or what's your?
I mean, there are like proper academic studies into. If you pick up a video game which allows a degree of character creation, so use Grand Theft Auto, for example, where there's a massive character creation suite, do you go a guy, you know, with a pink afro and he's wearing a clown suit and, you know, he looks nothing like your real life persona, or do you try and replicate Black Cat, bald head? Am I the Joe Donnelly in game? We were saying before we started recording, even when I'm playing Football Manager now, I've always got a save which is Celtic, and I'm not trying to sign, you know, Ronaldo or Messi or anyone. I'm keeping it as it is. You know, I'm doing my best to try and keep players from leaving the club or bringing the youth through in the same way. It just depends on the mood that I'm in. But I think, I'm a tracksuit manager. I would say. I like to be hands on at training. But it's amazing how you can. When you spoke about having these kind of fake conversations in your head, pulling players aside, and obviously games allow a lot more of that kind of customization today. I remember at the time when Premier Manager was at its kind of, for me, at its best, probably 1998, round about then, when Champman was obviously flying as well, a few years before the 01-02, which I would peg as the best Champman in my opinion. But there was a game called USM Ultimate Soccer Manager by Sierra, and that let you set the prices in the pie stalls as much as, you know, what the drills you're going to do in training. That's what I'm saying. And you could also choose sponsorship deals. And I remember at the time, you know, Man City before all the investment. I mean, quite fond of Man City as the underdog in the Manchester derby. And at the time they were sponsored by Brother. I know they had that for a number of years. And Brother was one of the sponsors which would come up at random in Ultimate Soccer Manager. And you could get all different companies, but I would save and come back out and reload until my team got Brother every time I started, just because I quite liked the font. You know, I didn't know anything about any of their hardware or their goods, but it was being able to set all these things which I enjoyed. Wild things, and I blame Theme Park for this, the top-down theme park simulator, like setting the price of pies really cheap so you sold loads, but then setting the price of drinks really high so that in my head that people would get these pies and if they did salty, and then I could put the drinks on, all the while, you know, we're getting beat every week in the actual game, being able to control these little things. It's amazing just how far you can let your mind wander and enjoy the simulation of it.
I think that the pie thing seems like the best thing that's ever happened to people. We totally managed to get that player just because we sell pies for that price. I've been playing Football Manager this year. I've got it again for the first time in a long time. Champ Manager 97-98. Loved it. One of my favourite achievements is winning the league with Celtic and signing Stoichkov at the end of the season. Amazing. Just like, this is amazing. But my wife, she you know, has the experience of known Football Manager, because in the past she would have friends that would be playing that, and it's all consuming. If you're not playing it, you're watching somebody else play it. But whenever you're in the zone or you're talking with people about it, it's amazing how much you really build into it. Like I loved just old management games like Premier Manager. That was my first game of management game, would be Premier Manager on the Acorn Archimedes, and then the Mega Drive later on, LMA Manager, Kevin Keegan's Player Manager, which was for the SNES. My wee brother came in one day, I was winning, but if you hung up your game or you stopped your game, you would automatically lose 3-0. And he ran into the room I was playing in, and he just pressed reset and ran out. Totally ruined my season. Really, really bad.
Amazing.
And but yeah, so football management games. And Joe, one of the things I must say is that I really, really like. I've seen some of the articles that you've written for Vice magazine and for different magazines about Football Manager. You really have approached it from so many different angles. Has it become an all-consuming part of your life, Joe?
Yeah, it can do, and it's somebody who advocates for video games and mental health. It's worth a wee disclaimer saying that, you know, whilst I love video games, and if you do too, you should keep it in balance like anything. Don't try and not be consumed too much by, don't let any other facets of your life suffer by trying to steer Queen's Park to the Champions League or something like that. But it is all consuming. One of the articles which I've written before was for Rock Paper Shotgun. I shared with you before we started recording. Rock Paper Shotgun at a PC gaming site about playing Football Manager, and again, tracksuit manager, dressed in a full tracksuit, playing up Matic because my girlfriend won't let me play it down the stairs because the kids are there. Putting on my boots as if I'm on the touchlines, and then for cup finals, if ever you get there, sticking a wee shirt and tie on, and it's ridiculous. I did that obviously for comic effect, but you do hear stories about that getting sent off and like watching the game in a different room. I rigged up my baby monitor for the purpose of the article so that I could, as if I'm watching in the stands. And I think again it goes back to the kind of the RPG stuff which you were saying. If you're not everybody's going to play it to that level of commitment, and again that was done for comic effect, but it's kind of getting over yourself a wee bit, just having fun, just letting yourself relax. Ultimately that's why people play video games. Is for a laugh, it's for fun. And I think like Football Manager is definitely one of those games that lets you, depending on how far you're willing to go, then you can have some right good fun with it.
We were off work the 2010, the really bad winter, so me and my flatmate Anton, massive Football Manager aficionado. In fact, it was whenever my wife came over to the house, or the flat that me and Anton shared at the time, and saw that we had downloaded Football Manager and realised, oh man, this is no. But on that occasion, we decided we would do on FIFA a full FA Cup. So we played FIFA all day and quite good matches. Discovering heroes. Every single game has been played. The draw, getting ready for exciting times. And my wife, who's my girlfriend at the time, phoned me to say that she was stranded in town, and I said, we'll just walk along to the flat and you can come and stay. So she walked along from the city centre to Denniston, but I'd just turned 30 the week before, and I still had some helium balloons left in the house, right? So Hannah turned up at the door, frozen, covered in snow, walks in, and me and my flatmate are in full suits for the cup final, setting off helium balloons outside the flat. And she just like stood like this, and it was like, amazing. You okay? She's like, yeah, we'll just have a bath. And went, okay, bye. Well, here we go now.
Team bath.
And it was one of my favourite days because we played it over the course of one day.
Amazing. Full
Full suits on at the end, make paper rosettes. Oh, it was brilliant.
I think at a time when, obviously everybody's really missing the football just now, and it's once it's safe to do so, we can't wait to get back. But I think there's something to be said for how you simulate it in the house. That sounds like a great day.
Oh, it's the best. I still think it'd be one of my favourite times ever. But you spoke about Man City earlier on, and we're going to play this little graphic just now as well. Man City were sponsored by IDOS too, who made Football Manager, and we talked earlier on, and in my last episode it was about the success association it comes with strips, and Manchester City in their IDOS years would have been at the times when they were in the lower divisions and working their way back up. So you have one season where they have promotion under Joe Royal to the back up, and then they're back down again the next season, and then they're back up. So you have this idea of, when maybe if you're a Manchester City fan, you might not have as fond memories of your strip with IDOS on it, where you're a neutral fan, you see and go, Champ Manager. And other teams sponsored by Football Manager include Watford and also Wimbledon. I saw an article about Watford's football management application that, when they were sponsored by them, that said that Watford now have access to the football management database where they will be able to discover new players. And I don't know how much that's worked for them, but certainly, do you see clubs using the Football Manager database to access?
It's interesting. I mean, Watford is Miles Jacobson, who is the kind of head honcho at Sports Interactive, who developed Football Manager. Is a massive Watford man, so he's managed to kind of make that come together. And I've been fortunate enough to be down in Miles's office down at Sports Interactive down in London, and he's got all the memorabilia. He's got a chair which is upholstered with like Watford strips with the Football Manager stuff on it. He is adamant that big managers do use it. I've interviewed him a few times over the years, and Andre Villas-Boas was still at Chelsea during one of the conversations we had, and he said he was a big advocate for using the databases. Stuff like the dynamic system, which the newer games have got, where it's kind of how people get on, and so it's kind of maybe if there's a big French contingent of players, they're naturally likely kind of gravitate towards one another because they can converse and their kind of native language and stuff like that. Maybe more of the Scottish boys will lump together and stuff like that. And Miles Jacobson has been invited along to training sessions with some of the big clubs, Man City, Chelsea, Manchester United, Liverpool, and he said he's been on team flights to Europe where who's playing Football Manager, for example, who is just chilling out on their own, they've got the tunes on, they don't want, that's their kind of pre-game ritual, even if it's a few days later, if it's a Champions League game, who, and this is his words, I'm paraphrasing, but who is letting off smelly farts, and who are the jokers that are wanting to blame it on someone else. And he said, and those lived experiences, he's fed them back into the game. So the dynamic system, I am in no way affiliated with Sports Interactive or Sega. I just love Football Manager. I'm not giving it good PR here, but I love that those story elements, like we said about the kind of RPG stuff. I think, and with the stats as well, again, going back to Andre Villas-Boas, he was looking at players who were identified as wonder kids and maybe looking at the stats which they were pulling through. Were they worth approaching? Were they worth monitoring? Were they worth scouting? And at the time, I mean, he was in charge of Chelsea. He's obviously still a high-profile manager, obviously over in Europe just now. And I think that there are managers all over that are definitely paying attention to the stats. One wee game which I've started playing in my spare time, which I think is quite interesting, and this is more looking at journalists who get things drastically wrong as opposed to the stats in the games getting them wrong, but it's maybe going back to 2010 and looking at what any of the people in games media or sports media said. Who were the wonder kids, and seeing who they got right 10 years later
really?
and who they got drastically wrong. It's a game which anyone can play. It's good fun. Puts a lot of pressure on the next person doing these top 10 wonder kids
totally.
coming through. But no, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating when you think about how statistical football's become recently. People on the analysis side of things talk about XG and all these false nines and all the phrases which is used today to analyse the game, which you'll see a lot of the kind of older pundits or older ex-players maybe not paying as much deference to, no, it's just about going and playing the game, when really, the game has evolved and it's rooted in how Football Manager's made up. I know for a fact that Sports Interactive hire analysts to work on their comms teams, for example, because they have an understanding of how the game is played, what the numbers mean, the kind of Moneyball side of things that's been popularised in baseball over the last 10 years or so, and to see managers really paying attention to it now. It's still a computer game, isn't it? It's still a video game, which I think it's amazing to see the worlds come together.
And it's also, I think it's one of those ones where you don't have to be a gamer, but you might still put that laptop on or have some access. You want to still have that control that really has that appeal to people.
Definitely,
doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's just I think we could have a full episode on Football Manager. I think we will. I have messaged Kevin Toms and he's agreed that he'll come on for a chat with me, so I'll be delighted to do that one.
Just to go back in Man City there as well, you mentioned Eidos Interactive. I mean, that was in the late 90s when Eidos looked after Tomb Raider.
Aye.
I mean, that was the biggest game in the world at the time. So if Man City, with all due respect to them, somewhat floundering at the time, not just Football Manager, Eidos looking after, everybody knew Lara Croft in the mid to late 90s,
Well, depending on how what people are watching this on, the picture I made in my Champ Manager setup for this my graphic that I've made, I've put Sean Goater with Lara Croft.
Oh, amazing.
So I found it like, yes, I'm going to put this in. But on to actual football games of the 80s as well. There's so many management games or player games that existed back then that were a nod to professional players like Emlyn Hughes International Soccer, Peter Beardsley's International Soccer, Gaz's Superstar Soccer, the Mexico 86, Peter Shilton's, what a great name, Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona.
No silliness there.
Peter Shilton's Hard Brexit, we would call it. Kick-Off, one of my favourites, Manchester United Europe. I think I became a bit of a Man U fan after that. And then into the 1990s, I had did you play? You were a Super Nintendo player?
I had. It was my mates had Super Nintendo. I had Mega Drive, but I spent a lot of time kind of straddling both. Pele was the kind of on the Mega Drive, which is one I remember my mate having and loving that. It's funny when you mentioned there about becoming a bit of a Man U fan. I've always found that even if I'm playing games today, you can pick up. I mean, I'm quite fond of Barcelona, but I would never consider myself a Barcelona fan. If I choose them in Football Manager or FIFA, whatever, and I don't know, you're bringing through players that you maybe fringe players that you weren't that sure of before, and then all of a sudden, it broadens your interest in how that player's doing in real life. I think that crossover it's amazing.
See, as a result, I thought Lee Martin was going to set the heather on fire when he came up to Scotland, because I was always my first choice in Manchester United Europe. But Nintendo, actually, they move into the gaming market, so does Sega. We have Sega sponsoring teams, but Nintendo sponsoring, I think, most high profile ones, Sevilla, with Diego Maradona. This was a time where I wouldn't have had access to La Liga TV at all, so we wouldn't really see it too often apart from up in World Soccer. But I do remember often seeing Diego Maradona in his Sevilla kit, and of course also Nintendo sponsored Fiorentina.
Yeah, the purple one.
Yeah, beautiful.
So nice. So it's purple and red. I mean, I'm not a fashion expert. Purple and red, I wouldn't really think would go, but it just looked so perfect on that strip.
Fiorentina had some great strips as well. Good sponsor, like 7-Up as well. Works really well with them.
Right,
but their Fila manufactured Nintendo sponsored strip of the 2000s and the late 90s. Just beautiful strips. I've actually got a couple of wee graphics we'll put up here just now to illustrate these.
Play to win.
And actually also Nintendo also sponsored, they were actually owned a football team, Kyoto Sanga FC, which is written in kanji, so you don't really see the Nintendo logo, but it's there. However, amongst the games that have been developed, there's 3 big main ones still to come from the development away from the ashes of games like Peter Shilton, Handball Maradona. I nearly said Hard Brexit there again. But also, like, you've got Microprose Soccer. Dino Dini is massive in the world of inventing Kickoff, Kickoff 2, and of course Sensible Soccer, Joe, which we spoke about earlier on. Not really a game that people would look at these days and see the realism of FIFA, but there's something special, Joe, about Sensible Soccer.
Yeah, it was just such good fun. I mean, I said that at the top of the recording, that I can go back and play it now, and you mentioned nostalgia. It's undoubtedly rooted in nostalgia for me, because it is just, everything's dead janky. You go in certain ways. You work out strategies that if you're playing a certain team, the keeper would always dive to the right, so you try to put it in the top left if you can. It was just good fun. I think that's it. It was just, it was... Even at the time when you're playing a top-down game, you knew that the graphics were... I mean, somebody who's... Again, we spoke about someone who might, be joining their video game enthusiasm with the latest FIFA. You're not going to look at Sensible Soccer and think it looked... you're going to look at it and think it looks terrible. At the time, we knew it didn't look, the same as what you're seeing on TV or in the stands. But it was just fun. And I think that in terms of... As I said, I kind of missed the Subbuteo boat in terms of that competitiveness if you're playing against your brother or your friends and stuff. But Sensible Soccer was the first game for me that gave that real, shouting at each other, covering the control pad when you're taking penalties, holding it up so that they've no way of knowing which way you're going. And that real, I say camaraderie, it's not that at all, it's wanting to strangle your best pal, that was the first game which really captured that essence, that competitiveness within a computer game.
And so I think as well, like you're talking about camaraderie, and that's the thing about gaming with somebody else with you. There's all the carry on that goes on with it too. There's the kind of nowadays we do you want a drink or something, a can Iron Brew or crisps and things, and when you're wee, people, there's all that fun and the kind of warm fuzzy feelings that you get looking back in the years and playing. Also about Sensible Soccer for me, I think it's the first time I found that I could play Celtic in a game. It's a 93-94 sort of Celtic team, and it was called, I think, Glaswegian, and it was like Glasgow who were Rangers, but you had if you were okay with Pep Bonner rather
Yeah.
than Pat Bonner,
Yeah.
and you could, work with that one. But I got, when I was 1994-95, Celtic played obviously the Wraith Rovers in the cup final, the League Cup final, but it was my birthday the day after.
Oh.
So my birthday tears of
Yeah.
the loss in the cup final was kind of made a bit better by playing a bit of sensible soccer with the real names, because it was the
Yeah.
international edition that you had the proper names. I think the idea had been easy to pick up but difficult to master with sensible soccer.
Yeah, definitely.
And then later on, Sensible World of Soccer, as we spoke about, really opening things up for in terms of known leagues. Joe, do you see people getting that chance to find out and discover new teams for the first time through things such as video games?
I think so. I mean, that was kind of what we were saying before about, like again, using Barcelona as the example. If there are players that are kind of coming through the youth setup there, I mean, I like to, keep tabs on the big teams and see the players that are coming through. But naturally, it's people will naturally know the kind of younger players coming through their own team. You wouldn't necessarily even know the youth players coming through in teams in the same league, for example. I think that it can birth new appreciations of clubs. If you take a team that, if you pick someone at random and it's a lower league English team, maybe non-league team or something, and then you take them as far as you can to the Championship or into the Premiership or something like that, you're gonna, you could have that kind of I don't know, appreciation of them. I actually watched this. Funny you should say that. That Rob McElhenney, the actor it's also in Philadelphia, him and Ryan Reynolds have bought Wrexham recently, and there's been a lot of press around that. And he said that he made the kind of it was an interview just with, I think it was BBC maybe, Newsbeat, and he was saying that football's big in the US, obviously as big as it's ever been, but maybe not as big as it is on these shows. But he was saying that Wrexham, he liked the kind of working class ethos of the town and the people, and that was one of the reasons why they moved to get in with them. But he mentioned that he'd been aware of them through football management games and stuff like that. I didn't quote Football Manager, but it was whatever one he was playing. So getting a kind of feel for them then. I always kind of wonder that as well, if you're a player and you're maybe linked with somebody, would you play Football Manager to kind of get a better feel with them then? Because I know that if I knew nothing about, I don't know, any team, and I'm wanting to know a little bit about who's the coaches there, who's the physios and stuff like that, would I take that for a trial run?
I've heard players have used FIFA as a way, as an outlet of
interesting.
checking out what other players are like, or maybe only know somebody from having seen them in FIFA.
Yeah, and that's putting a lot of responsibility on the game developers then, because if they've got it wrong, I know that it's under scrutiny now so much, and you think about players that are looking at, you said this before we were recording, about their their little shield and what's their stats, and do they agree with them, or are they kind of thinking, Christ, I don't know if I'm as good as that, it demands that the developers know what they're doing across the board. I know that they'll have specific leagues which they focus on, but I can remember playing as Celtic in FIFA 96, the first 3D style one, and Pierre Van Hooijdonk was, and in 96 I'm not even sure if we had assigned numbers in the league. I know he's number 9 in Celtic, but I don't know if it was formalised like it is now. But he was number
5.
Number 5, I remember it being something ridiculous.
And he's a defender.
And he was left back or something, wasn't he?
Ridiculous,
Every time you started, because it wasn't as sophisticated as it became even in the late 90s, where if you moved a player as striker, he would stay there. Every game you had to make sure you put him up front. So you start a game against Rangers or something, and you've got Pierre playing at left back, and oh goodness, I need to make sure I get him up. So I mean, that even then the research must have been limited to the point where, even if it wasn't formalised numbers, I mean, being able to catch a game, there's no YouTube then obviously, but you would see that he always wore number 9, so even that was missed.
I bought a Mega Drive off somebody when I was about 16, 17. He was selling it for £50 or £30 because he was trying to save up for a PlayStation. It just come out, and just because you could edit in Sensible Soccer on the Mega Drive, and you could also could you edit in Sensible Soccer? So could you edit in FIFA on the Mega Drive? Could you edit names?
You definitely
transfer. You could transfer, couldn't you?
You could transfer.
So that was the purpose of going, I can start. And I found a guy called Harrison Chongo who played for Zambia. And he was one of my favourite players. And I think I was doing a season with Motherwell at the time. But do you know one of the big deals about Sensible Soccer? We talk about graphics and realism. See, Sensible Soccer, it's one of the first games that has accurate colour of skin. So black players were black players, because things like John Barnes had been in earlier games before, although you were using John Barnes, it was a white graphic for him.
Yeah.
So that's a huge thing as well, isn't it?
That's massive, and I mean, representation in games is still being spoken about just now. It's still got so far to go. And always, whenever I'm speaking about representation in games, I qualify the conversation by saying I'm a white straight male, so you can't really get more in the majority than that. So there are people out there who know much better than me. But The Last of Us 2, Naughty Dog's hit that was out last year, had homosexual characters, there was trans characters, although the depiction of the trans character was debated by some as perhaps not as rounded as it could be, but nevertheless there was a trans character in it, which is very unusual for video games. But to think that to go back to even the 90s and there not be people of colour in a game, and again, if I'm playing that in the early 90s as a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old, as a white person, I'm maybe not noticing it as much at that age, but if you're a gamer who's picking up and is aware of that kind of thing, and as a black person, you think, and you're not seeing yourself represented, and then suddenly you are, it's great. I mean, it's a shame and it's shocking that maybe it wasn't up until that point, but it's a real it can seem like something almost trivial, especially against today's standards. But I dare say that was a real big step for computer games at the time.
I listened to a podcast with the creator of Sensible Soccer, and he just said it was the other people beforehand had just been lazy not to do it.
Yeah, interesting.
And he's like, we just did it because you could do it. It was why not? Like even with FIFA, there were very few. Pierre Van Hooydonk's also white in the FIFA 95 game. And like the idea of this is, even Subbuteo wasn't until the 90s that they put 3 black players in the Subbuteo team, and whenever they started to relaunch with the Premier League teams. But the kind of depth of going into games nowadays we kind of take for granted, but for then it was totally groundbreaking. On to looking also at sponsorships. Sega sponsored some teams in the 1990s as they moved into the launching the Dreamcast. Arsenal spring to mind of their strips. Sampdoria. 1991-92 they had Melchester Rovers though, which people often forget because obviously they don't exist in the real world. And is it JEF United in Japan, who also were sponsored by Sega, which I think is where Sega's offices in Japan had been. But we've spoken about FIFA and the rise of FIFA nowadays and how big a thing that culturally is. People might not know football, but they know FIFA, or also it nearly didn't exist as a game, FIFA, because of the way that EA Sports and we'll go back out from the UK to the US, how the US views football. What would you think it was that made big companies maybe not understand just what they could have with a game like a football game? Yeah,
I think like in the Western world, obviously America is massive in the world of video games. Series is like the NFL, we've got John Madden over there, MLB The Show, I believe it's called now, which is the baseball one. Those games were already doing massive over there, and I mean, I don't know this as a fact, but I mean, you think about 1994 and what that did for American football. Obviously, the World Cup being hosted there, and also in terms of the timeline, which runs with when FIFA really kind of took off. FIFA 94 being the first time that FIFA existed, wasn't it? FIFA International
It came out December 1983.
Yeah, ahead of
very short turnaround.
Yeah.
No soccer league at that point. Nothing.
Yeah. So I mean, just the kind of growing popularity in football over there. But you think about if even this is something, again, it's somebody that's interested in video games that notices this, and no doubt there are people out there who notice. People who don't can look at this if they so wish in their spare time. But if you look at Sony, obviously sponsors one of the big sponsors of the Champions League. So if you're looking at archive footage of the Champions League, and if it's around the 90s you'll see PlayStation, if it's into the early 2000s it's PS2 as the boarding around the sides, if it's Zidane that's scoring certain goals, there's PS3, PS Vita, right through PS4 and 5. And I always think that it's a real interesting kind of stamp in time when you think, when was that game again? If you've not had it come up and you see there's a PS3 banner at the side, you think, oh, that must have been between 2006 and 2010s, and I think that making those I don't know, like we identify certain games with certain periods of video games and football when they were running alongside each other is really interesting as well. Dreamcast is synonymous with actually Dreamcast with Arsenal in the early 2000s, and also he's been spoke about how ET really came close to doing Atari, and the Dreamcast with its gambling with Shenmue, massive game which has since received a Kickstarter. It did Shenmue 1, Shenmue 2, lost a lot of money and interest. Kickstarter in 2016 for Shenmue 3, and it came out and finished the saga off, but that game nearly ruined Sega, and it saw them taking a real step back in the games which they were developing. Obviously they publish Football Manager, for example, they do a lot of publishing. Still got Sonic and the Mario kind of Olympic stuff which comes together for the Switch, but for such a prominent team in the Premier League to be doing so well at the time as well, to have Dreamcast, that was no small thing for the gaming industry either.
It's funny as well when you see like Juventus sponsored by Sony, and it's like Sony Sony Walkman, and then it's Sony Minidisc, but now people associate almost instantly Sony with PlayStation.
It's almost like PlayStation comes first, isn't it? Like you don't often see Sony being advertised on its own anymore. I think if people are thinking football, they think of that Juventus, obviously the black and white. They think of the Champions League winning one, the blue one with the yellow stars
strip,
up here, Gianluca Vialli lifting the trophies.
We'll put a wee infographic up for both of them now, I think. There we go, that's it up. There we are.
But I think that PlayStation comes before Sony now almost, because Sony obviously still do loads of different hardware, but it's certainly, for the last long period of time that the PlayStation's taking front and centre.
In the world of what we exist now, is this kind of duopoly in the battle between Xbox and PlayStation. There's also football, although they've had some great games in between, like Actua Soccer and ISS or Pro Evolution Soccer, really, and FIFA are the two ones that are fighting it out. From around 2001, 2002, it's almost a battle. PES are the team that are in front, even though they've got teams like Middlebrook and Anfield Reds and stuff. I wonder if people maybe had a look at the Master League and thought, do you know what, a European Soccer League, a European Super League might be I've got this idea. It's based on the Master League.
It's definitely parallel.
We'll just take 12 of them this time.
What's your favourite FIFA and PES?
Probably now FIFA, but I loved PES 2004. I've still got my 2004 PES game and my PlayStation 2 game just because it's a Seville team that's in it, and I kept that, and they were a great team. So maybe you think about nostalgia and fonder memories. My friend Paul Goody, who popped up in the last podcast about St Mirren, me and him just have all my computer gaming experience was all back with me and him as the other person to be playing alongside.
I think that's the thing though. I mean, we said this earlier, you take things that you're enjoying in real world football into computer games. I remember being more into FIFA in the earlier days because of the license, and having Larson and Sutton kick off in FIFA 2002, my first PlayStation 2 game actually. And then if you hit shoot full bar and hold L2 or R2 in, you could curl the ball, and Sutton would always beat the keeper for whatever reason, a glitch in the game. I remember in 2004, so playing FIFA 2004, which would have come out at the end of 2003, and obviously Henrik Larsson was set to leave in the summer, and devastated in footballing terms. But I remember just playing FIFA one day and thinking, like, the next instalment of FIFA, Henrik will be at Barcelona. I can go Barcelona, but it's not the same. We'll have Henri Camara up front with us or whatever. And it was just, obviously you've got that devastation seeing Henrik cry in that game against Dundee United and knowing that he's leaving, but actually picking up the control pad and thinking, the thing which I spend so much time playing away from football will no longer have Henrik Larsson as the leading the lines for Celtic, and just being dead. I don't know, it hit again. It was almost like, oh my goodness.
Craig Beattie.
You're
totally right. How big a deal then do you think the idea of FIFA taking licensing? How big a deal was that then?
It's interesting, isn't it? Like, I think that it goes into the kind of murky world of business, doesn't it? In terms of, we've saw in the last week at the time of recording about the European Super League, announced on a Sunday night and dead in the water by Tuesday. That money is just so powerful in football. Obviously, with the licensing, it's a strange one because it's always, and even players, Zlatan Ibrahimovic was upset with the likeness that was used, and I don't know, like, again, when I go back to video games being primarily about fun, one of the things which did, for me, put place FIFA above was the fact that you had the real clubs and the real strips and the real names. I'm not a licensing expert, so if they want to wade in because of money now, fair enough. I don't know why it's been permissible for so many years up until now. But I don't know, I think, again, if you talk about games being stigmatised, being considered child's play by certain people, the fact that these publishers and players are so interested in how they are perceived, how their likeness is perceived in a game, that speaks volumes of how seriously they know that the fans take it. From a broad spectrum of ages, that that it's worth that kind of effort and time in court or whatever else.
It's such a big deal as well to have your on the cover stars as well.
Yeah.
Now it's a big deal. I think I spoke to this at the start of the when we first met this morning. FIFA 1996 on the Sega Saturn is a picture from the Anglo-Italian Cup final.
Yeah.
And now everyone's fighting to be the cover star.
I know. We're saying that about the FIFA Manager, which no longer exists. That disbanded in 2014, I think. So 2013 FIFA Manager, and that used to be Total Club Manager. And I remember in the 2003 edition again, which released the year before, was Robson was on the cover in the UK version. It was Lothar Matthäus in the German one. In 2005, which came out in 2004, it was Jose Mourinho after winning the Champions League of Porto. And the year between, the 2004 that was released the year before, was Martin O'Neill after his exploits in Seville. And I don't think that, because they could have chosen Mourinho that year, obviously it became a household name when he won this with ultimately the same team that beat Celtic in 2003, won the Champions League the following year, and of course moved to the Premiership after that. But I think that the significance of having Martin O'Neill on that cover, it shouldn't be underplayed, because I'm not even sure even the greatest managers at Celtic since, Brendan Rodgers, in terms of success and the profile that he brought to the club, I don't know that he would have fit that bill now. Maybe at Leicester if they do something there, Claudio and Ranieri maybe in years gone by. But I think having Martin O'Neill on that cover spoke volumes for how big he was considered on a global basis at Celtic, given how good he'd been as a manager.
It's that there's also you talk about the people who are on the front cover as well, but I did find out one on the way here, Alan McCoist, director of football, which is a real game, and David O'Leary's manager for the Game Boy Advance. But
I wonder how much these guys actually know about that, though. Do you know? Did Gaza know about the one that was on the Spectrum in the early 90s?
Oh, take that! but whenever it's like you see that association of it has that association of success. When somebody's there, regardless of that. But if FIFA or EA Sports were choosing Martin O'Neill to be in the front cover.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's in people are critical of the Scottish game up and down the country and all over the world, but I think what Celtic did, as fans, we know, getting to the UEFA Cup final that year, some of the teams that we beat along the way to disprove some of that notion that Celtic weren't a big team. But again, having Martin O'Neill as that cover star, it's a very, and if people aren't interested in video games, they could poo-poo that, but it was a very sought after, as you say, the players are fighting, hand and fist to get themselves on that front cover now. And for Martin O'Neill to be placed among those greats is excellent.
I heard Rio Ferdinand threatened to go down to EA Sports and tear the place down after he was given 65 out of 99 for his passing.
Yeah. And that's it. I mean, clearly the players are paying attention to what they're getting there. I often wonder if there are players who feel like they've been given too high a number and don't say anything. Would they just sit quietly? And I would buy it and have it up my wall, I think.
We want interesting to find out who's finding all the research on this just now. Actually, with also speaking of specific years for FIFA and Pro Evolution Soccer, Lazio were sponsored by PES 2009. In that season, and Swindon Town FIFA 2014. I'm not going to bother with a graphic for Lazio. They can talking of European conquest. But FIFA and PES really take the monopoly on football games on consoles these days, and in fact, FIFA almost becomes the go-to name, the same way that people talk about WWE for wrestling. And also, like, everything's shifted towards much more of an acceptance, as you spoke about gaming, the age and stage of people. Players use FIFA as a way of kind of gauging opinions of them, skills, the standing in the world, their own popularity. How much though has it changed in terms of the online community presence, where FIFA isn't just played two pals playing each other in the room. FIFA is now played as a game where people are doing online leagues or Ultimate Team, or collecting money to put towards teams. How big an impact has that had on football?
It's huge, isn't it? I mean, there's guys who make a living from it now, playing professionally for different teams. One of the most interesting things, in my opinion, that's come out of that is the guys who do make a living out of it, that play FIFA or PES professionally. They're obviously experts at the game, and they get so good at each passing iteration, but with each passing iteration, and when this could annoy you or I, where I don't know, it feels like the drawback for a shot is slightly slower than it was last year. So all of a sudden you're skying your shots, or you're putting them straight into the keeper's arms, whereas before you'd worked out how to put them in the top bin. That's a wee bit annoying on a Friday night if you're playing your mate online, or if you've got them sat down next to you in normal circumstances. But if you're doing it for 11 and somebody's changed this thing, incrementally changed it, because I try to make it more realistic to real world football, that can throw your whole game off. So if you're used to, I don't know, taking the ball just inside the box and letting one fly into the bottom left-hand corner, but there's half a second now, which is slightly different. It's like going to a plumber and saying, you can no longer use this tool to take off a waste trap at a bath. You now need to use this, and you've got to relearn it. For these guys who are on the world stage, because esports is now televised internationally, I think that's fascinating that they need to relearn certain elements of their job every year. But the fact that they can make a living from it, the fact that there are certain tournaments that are worth hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars, or pounds all over the world, speaks to the online spectrum, how big it is now. And even being able to jump on FIFA, I don't know, hypothetically tonight, and play someone anywhere in Europe, who's sitting in their house when we're in national lockdown as well, even more interesting. And have them shouting over the headset, they could be playing a 10-year-old who's infinitely better at FIFA than me and getting beaten, falling out, or throwing the control pad away. But I think that it makes the world smaller, but it's, I don't know, again, at a time when we can't get to the football, these wee things I think help people enjoy the sport, even in their spare time as well.
I actually had I think that EA have made increments so much that I just get rubbish every year.
Yeah.
Played the guy last week, and I got a message. I was getting beat for like 4-1 or something. I got a message at 90 minutes. Did you have a message? Opened up and it said, "Is there any point in you continuing this?" And I was like, "You are what a horrible person."
Oh man!
But like, also the way that kids or people were curating their team for Ultimate Team. It's almost the same way as in the 1950s, kids collected cigarette packets with players in them, isn't it? This idea of collecting and building.
Panini sticker books in the 90s. I mean, I've no idea if they still exist.
They still do.
If people still trade them in the playground, but
not as common. Match Attack seems to be the big one just now.
Yeah, I like the fact that there's still. I mean, again, as somebody who advocates of video games, I do believe that no other kind of pursuit or hobby should suffer physical exercise or getting out and smoking cards. I remember Abdullah Erkin, a midfielder or a striker for Turkey, Euro 96, had the sticker book, and I had everybody apart from him.
Really?
The only one, I think I've threw it out, I wish I'd kept it, and I keep thinking there's an article in there, I should email him and see if he wants to do an interview. We can talk about how he was the only player in that sticker book. I have no idea what he was like as a player, but the name is just,
do you think that players have that same value of worth, where they think, I wonder how many stickers the company printed of me to make me rare?
I wonder there. I mean, like, it kind of goes down to there's parallels there with the stats. If they feel hard done by with their stats, so they care about how many
stickers are out there. They'll never know, because they can just phone up and go, it's 1,700, and then they don't know, is that any good, is that bad? We spoke earlier on with, like, you talked about like Microsoft and Xbox, or PlayStation 2 or PlayStation 3 and Sony at the time, and like even had sponsors of like Portland Timbers and also Ozair with PlayStation 2. So it's become so much now that the brands consoles are really at the forefront, even before the companies that make them themselves. And Joe, we've also spoken, you've touched on esports and how important esports are to clubs. Clubs are really recognising this. Where do you see this going in the future?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, you could be employed by a club now and be playing your FIFA, playing your Pro Evolution Soccer, wearing the kit. I noticed now that Paris Saint-Germain have got a team of League of Legends players. League of Legends is like a massive multiplayer online game. It's about fantasy and grouping war tactics and fighting with each other, all kind of Lord of the Ringsy. They play wearing Paris Saint-Germain strips, playing a game which is obviously nothing to do with football. So, I mean, the sky's the limit with that. I'm not really sure how that works. As somebody who loves video games, I do believe that it makes more sense in my head that if you're representing the team, you're at least playing a football game.
Do you think that's got to be something then that's going to be like, you have teams whose online presence as esports is better than an actual team?
Yeah, I mean, it could easily be that, couldn't it? I think it's fascinating. I think it's great for video games and football. I mean, if they're branching beyond the genre, then my worry is that it becomes a bit money then, more than it becomes a bit more cynical. It's just about gathering the best players in the same way that they do in football. But at least it's football. You know, this is just about, you know, you're flying the flag for that club, but we're actually not really doing anything about football anymore. But
I think the Philadelphia 76ers, they own the UK's top League of Legends team.
really,
And
there you go.
You get Wolfsburg as well, but Wolfsburg actually were one of the first football teams to sign a FIFA player.
That's right,
as
yeah.
well. A
David
guy-
Bythway, is that?
Yeah, from Wolverhampton.
I've actually interviewed him before
Really?
about aggression in FIFA.
Tell me about that, because is it aggression it causes, or
Yeah, so
aggression-
like it was more just about how you handle defeat in these high-profile tournaments. So whilst, you know, if you are playing with your brother in the house and he beats you, you can take that off and not speak to him for the rest of the, you know, the rest of the day of the week. Whatever. If you're playing your mate, or if you're playing a stranger online, you can just put the control pad down and you might be in a bit of a grump, but that's it. But if you've got a camera on you, how do you manage? You know, how do you get to a cup final and lose a last-minute goal really cheaply, whilst still trying to maintain a level of composure? You know, the last thing you want to do is shake someone's hand and admit defeat, but you know, you kind of need to do it. You need a level of decorum, and yeah, Dave was a lovely guy. It was a number of years ago now, but he was just saying, he was basically just talking through how difficult it can be, and the psychology of. And this is when, I mean, this was back in 2014 or 15, so it's become a lot more commonplace now to have players representing the team. But it was just at the kind of start of that, and it was just kind of seeing, what are the challenges? Because it sounds like the best job in the world, doesn't it? You know, getting paid by a football team to play FIFA, but you need to be in the top of your game all the time, like professional football players do on the pitch. You know, you're not allowed error, you're not allowed mistake, and you need to be able to deal with defeat in the same way that the real world guys do.
like talking about aggression, like when me and my brother played, when I lived at home, I really missed not living at home, and being with playing football games with my brother. It was like if you lost, it would be punches thrown, headlocks.
You'd make the news if you did that in any of these tournaments.
You can,
flip the
you could if
chairs
it's two brothers. Oh, it's okay, they're brothers.
WWE.
Loads injuries, or that bloody wrestling, as my dad calls it. Joe, you spoke often. I mean, the great things that I found about playing games with, regardless of a win or losing, was the positivity that you have with your friends, and that opportunity for sort of positive mental health and well-being that you don't even think about at the time, but looking back you realise those are happy places that you've been to. Your book Checkpoint, which I've got here, is fantastic. Joe, how important, I don't know if it's going to come up backwards there, we go. I feel a bit like Graham Norton now. This great book here. So
I would have come on the podcast anyway, even if we weren't talking about it.
but Joe, like, this was obviously a process that very close to your heart and very close to everything about it. Would you like to share with the book? And there's so many important things that kind of come from this, how you advocate mental health and mental well-being.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've always used video games as a means of escapism, like a lot of people do. And I don't mean like escaping, you know, really negative things like depression or anything. Just about, even if it was back when I was still at school, just, you know, I've had quite a hard day. I've been doing cross country at school and I'm knackered and I just want to stick on FIFA and just chill out. I've always used it as a means of just kind of putting real life on pause and doing video games. And in 2008, my uncle sadly took his own life, and I threw myself into video games as that mean of escapism, more so than normal, just playing everything to just kind of escape what was at the time a pretty negative time in my life. And I then went away to Australia for a couple of years with my girlfriend and came back and wanted to pursue a different career. I was a plumber at the time after leaving school. Super Mario links there between video games and plumbing. And I wanted to pursue journalism, and always bought the PlayStation magazines and PC Gamer and all that kind of stuff growing up, and started writing about video games. And then I discovered a raft of independent games which tackle themes of depression and mental health, OCD, alcoholism, games which I didn't know existed. And I eventually had a column with Vice where I was writing about video games and mental health and how the two overlap. And there was kind of restructuring at Vice, and there was no longer room for the column. And then I left the video games industry when my girlfriend fell pregnant, started working for Celtic, and always felt like I still had more to say about video games and mental health. Pitched 404 Inc., the independent publisher from Edinburgh who published Checkpoint, brilliant publisher, everybody should buy their books. Buy Checkpoint or not if you wish, but they look after some really good books, not least and really good authors. Chris McQueer, who does Hings, and HWG, Here We F and Go. Not sure if I'm allowed to swear or not. Which is two fantastic books written in Glaswegian short story books, but they really look after kind of really down to earth subjects and relatable subjects. So I was delighted that they took on Checkpoint. And I basically explore my own mental health journey, kind of coming to terms with my uncle's suicide and how video games were there for me. Speak to a lot of professionals, a lot of players, and a lot of academics about video games and mental health. And yeah, that's essentially what Checkpoint is. One of the best things which, and this sort of relates to football in the sense that it relates to the kind of machismo culture which exists, certainly in Scotland, certainly in the west of Scotland, which is where you and I grew up, Paul, where guys don't really talk about how they're feeling. And that is at the root of why my uncle's no longer here, because he wasn't able, for one reason or another, to talk about how he was feeling. As an aside, I've since been diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorder. I take medication, I've been to counsellors and stuff, eventually faced up to my own issues. But whilst writing my column for Vice and then eventually Checkpoint, I've had some of my friends, some of my closest friends, have approached me privately and said, it's amazing that you're writing about this, about video games and mental health. I had no idea that you were going to counselling or you're taking medication. I've actually been taking medication for 6 months, and nobody knew about it. And they did talk to some people, but they hadn't kind of said it explicitly to the group. And these are guys that I'd been playing under normal circumstances 5-a-sides with every week, drinking in the pub with every week, not a mention of it. And in an ideal world, they'd feel comfortable enough to speak openly about it. I know that it's a difficult thing to do, I speak from experience, but the fact that they were able to reach out privately and say, this is what I've been doing. And it could mean it's not just about my story, it's about being able to normalise it through video games and mental health. They could relate to both through their own experiences and then speak about it. So I thought it was things like that. This, in terms of Checkpoint, it was always a kind of passion project, for want of a better term, to speak about two things which I'm passionate about and raise awareness about mental health and get people talking. It sounds really cheesy or profound. I try to sound profound about it, but it's the truth. And the fact that some of my mates have come back and said that, and some strangers as well, some mental health charities have spoken about it. It's been a really, really heartening experience.
It's a wonderful book, and it takes so many different people's experiences as well. And it also looks at the way in which people channel positivity that come from games. And I think that one thing that we're missing within this situation that we're in just now with the pandemic is not being able to see each other, and not being able to see friends. But it's also, whenever as boys and as men, it's harder. It's hard to talk about how you're feeling. Yeah. It's hard to talk about things when it's becoming heavy, and that's ultimately, I think, is such an important thing to do. And whether or not, there's a lot of things with group chats, and then I've had some friends that have passed away through suicide in the past few years. Yeah. And then I didn't know at the time how that person was feeling, and they spoke to me the week before to say about meeting up, and then a separate group chat, that suicide started a sparking of multiple messages going between the boys and saying, listen lads, I've it. And then all of a sudden, when we spoke about things again, when we see each other, we'd be able to be a bit more open about it.
It's terrible that obviously someone suffers the most and pays the kind of ultimate price, whatever, for want of a better term, but I think being able to kickstart those conversations, like you said about the group chats there, it's invaluable. And it's when you see it all the time, you never really know how people are feeling, and it's about reaching out. It's not easy, and speak from first-hand experience. I've mentioned in the book, in 2008 was when my uncle left us, and 2012 was when I eventually faced up to it, got a doctor's appointment. It wasn't until 2014 that I was seeing a counsellor and then been prescribed medication. So it was a long process for me. There was 2 years where I'd already made that first step before I made my second, so I know it's hard. And it sounds so stupid, it sounds so easy just to check in on somebody, how you doing, or saying to somebody, I'm not feeling great. And it's easy when you do it. It's a difficult stage to get to, and it can make the world a difference. It can be the difference between life and death. That's the bottom line.
It's almost like sometimes we put on an avatar.
Yeah, exactly.
And walk out.
Exactly.
Joe, I'm going to say thanks so much for coming along today. I really appreciate that. And I also, Checkpoint, How Video Games Power Up Minds, Kick Ass and Save Lives. is the book that I would really recommend that people read. It's such a great book to pick up, and there's so many interesting points and so many personal points, but it's a great book how we also access games and how games don't have to be that narrative that you follow, that you can create your own things. The unexpected growth of video gaming has a profound impact on home computing. The notion of writing and playing games sort of undermined what had happened with the educational sort of pretensions that had driven the initial boom. And Britain moves from the 1980s. The seeds are sown for this new technological economy based in sort of high-based firms and financial industries, and people are moving out the bedrooms, and it becomes much, much bigger. It also had a huge impact on leisure pursuits and the way that football can be accessed, and ultimately that's what we've been looking at today, how people access football when they're not at the game. Well, football has had a massive impact on computer games nowadays. Computer games have had a massive impact, and the pendulum has kind of swung the other way, and the perception of gamers has changed. But whatever your own thoughts are on this episode, I'm sure, guys, that the screeching sound of a Spectrum loading screen or the snap of a Subbuteo player under a knee will give you back those warm feelings of nostalgia, as may some of the strips that we've looked at over the years. Many thanks to my guest, Joe Donnelly. Joe's book, Checkpoint, How Video Games Power Up Minds, Kick Ass and Save Lives, is available from 404 Inc. and available from most good bookshops, and I highly recommend it. A State of Mind Seller Jerseys is a State of Mind media production. Many thanks to Paul John Dykes for having me in, and Kevin Wilson for production and editing. All the best. See you soon. It's not game over just yet. We might come back in for some more games to play, Joe.
That sounds good. Happy to come back whenever.
Oh,
don't ask me to play Subbuteo though. See if I need to recreate that David Beckham goal against Wimbledon in '96 or whatever it was. I won't manage it.
We might get somebody's mum to come in and hoover up and just play it kneeling down on the floor.
Yeah, that sounds good.
The story so far, the story continues. Take care of yourselves and each other. Thank you.
Is this a bit of history?
It is! Out with a shot, and it's there!